This is Musical Talk.
Musical Talk.
The UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Musical Talk. The UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Musical Talk. My name is Nick Hudson. A short one this week, but we got a proper one coming up for you next week. This is almost the first half of that episode. This week I had a chat to Robert Gordon about how to succeed in business without really trying, that he and I saw at the Royal Festival Hall, and then we talked briefly about Something Rotten that he saw on Broadway. Next week you're going to be hearing more from Robert as he discusses more of the shows that he saw on Broadway, so look out for that, and in the meantime enjoy this discussion. We have been to see a wonderful concert at the Royal Festival Hall of the classic Frank Loesser, rarely performed in this country, musical How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, and it was conducted by our good friend Mr. Mike Dixon, and it had an array of wonderful talent in the show.
I mean, it was wonderful to hear such a huge orchestra. That's the first thing I have to say. I think that one of the big bonuses of these Albert Hall or Festival Hall concerts when they do them, I'm thinking of Follies as well, is the fact that you don't just get a small, nowadays pit bands are getting smaller and smaller, and you don't just get 6 or 7 pieces in the pit with lots and lots of electronic stuff. You do get, I don't know, was it 35?
Probably 40,
or probably 40-piece orchestra. And I thought it was brilliantly, to my ears, it was brilliantly conducted, and it made, at times, it made you realise how good the music is. I think the only thing I would criticise is there were some problems with sound balance. Now, this is quite difficult, I think, because it's a one-off concert.
Well, that's the whole problem with these shows in general, is that they have so little time to rehearse.
Yes.
The reading of the lines is sometimes a bit wooden, and sometimes they fumble over lines.
Well, I didn't mind that because I thought actually the reading of the lines in this case was generally very good and very funny, and I thought wonderful Clark Peters, he made a very obvious sort of fluff, and he made a joke about it as part of the performance, and everybody laughed, and it was great. It contributed to the liveness of it.
But there's problems with the lighting being things off cue, and certain areas not being lit properly.
People were often singing and they weren't being lit, and things like that. But I think that doesn't matter, because you go for the oral experience, and I felt that at times I couldn't hear the lyrics, and the lyrics are at times extremely funny, and it's not the actor's fault if you can't hear the lyrics because you've got a huge orchestra behind you and you're not properly mic'd. No doubt that can all be rectified in the BBC, in the broadcast.
Yes, because they were recording it, and quite interestingly, as a concept, I found the whole piece was being done as a radio play from the 1940s or something, wasn't it?
Yes, they had all their sort of old-fashioned radio studio gadgets and things to do sound effects, which is quite fun, really, for the piece.
Yeah, it added a whole new level for us as the audience. The star of this show for me, though, was, I mean, we'll talk about other people, but Hannah Waddingham can brighten up any production.
She's not only a very glamorous lady, she's a very tall woman. She's not only very glamorous, but she's very good at comedy. She can act a comic scene as well as any of the great sort of Hollywood comedians of the 50s, which is kind of what she was pastiching in this show as the sort of bimbo character. She can, she reminded me very much of the character from Singing in the Rain, the woman,
the one who talks and then no one likes her.
She talks terribly, so they have to dub her. She did this beautifully, and she didn't have much to sing, but of course when she did sing, she's such an accomplished singer. She's a very accomplished performer all round, and I felt she made a role that I actually saw. I mean, I saw this production on Broadway a few years ago with Daniel Radcliffe, and I don't really remember the woman who played that part. But
you leave this version with such a strong image of her in your mind.
Absolutely.
And the main lead, the Harry Potter lead, was played by Jonathan Groff, who I thought, okay, I've heard of Glee, but he's really famous because I realised he was the speaking and singing voice of Kristoff in Frozen.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even realise that. Well, the thing is, he has a fan base.
Spring Awakening, of course. He was in the original Broadway cast of Spring Awakening.
And he has a fan base, but of course he's been doing musicals since a very early age. And I thought he was very competent, very smooth.
As Finch.
As J. Pierpont Finch, the scheming young, ambitious young guy who's going to try and make it to the top and does so very quickly. I thought he was charming, and I thought he was very different from Daniel Radcliffe, of course, because Daniel Radcliffe is so small that when you saw Radcliffe doing it, he had a kind of a vulnerability and a cheekiness about him, which made the character work. Whereas I thought what Jonathan Groff did, because he's attractive.
He's also 10 years younger.
Yes, but because Jonathan Groff is attractive in a slightly more television style or Hollywood style, matinee idol way, yes, he made the sort of assumed innocence seem, I think, a lot more calculating. But I thought what was absolutely charming and what worked really well in this production, there seemed to be real rapport between Cynthia Erivo and Jonathan Groff, and I thought the one moment where they had to hold this enormously long kiss was very, very funny and very, very sweet, because it gave you a bit of the love interest that there is in the piece, but it also sent it up at the same time, and the audience were roaring their approval. But I think they both gave extremely accomplished performances. I felt for a pair of leading actors who can't have had very much rehearsal time with the director and with the orchestra and with everyone else, they seemed very much on top of what they were doing. And I thought, I did expect Groff to be really efficient, as he was, apart from anything else. But what surprised me was Cynthia Erivo.
She's always been very good. I mean, she was wonderful in I Can't Sing, as you said, but she was also apparently very good in The Colour Purple, because she was Dolores in the Sister Act tour. Nick Colicos was in the show as well, and he's always a joy to watch. He was also in Sister Act, and he provided, amongst other things, the voice of the book, which I thought was the funniest. I wanted more of the voice of the book, because I think it's such a wonderful idea. And the whole piece is a parody of the 1950s musicals like Pajama Game and other such pro-Americana musicals, aren't they, Robert?
Yes, of course. This is an anti where, in the 50s, the musicals which dealt with corporate America, like the Pajama Game, and celebrate, if you like, the corporate nature of America. This one, about 9 years later, takes a really cynical view. But of course it is the beginning of the 60s, and it's the beginning of the movement that quite soon leads to Cabaret and Hair, where the Americans are being critical of all those aspirational musicals that celebrate the American dream.
And Sondheim, of course.
Yes, and so it coincides with Sondheim's rather anti-Golden Age musical theatre. It's still definitely a Golden Age musical, but it sends up the nature of the values that the genre propagates.
Is it like Gypsy, and it's one of the last proscenium arch American book musicals?
Yeah, there's a last gasp after this with Hello Dolly and Fiddler on the Roof, but I think in a way after Fiddler on the Roof nobody would take those sort of musicals, those realist Broadway big shows played full out to the audience. No one would take those seriously anymore. You had to do something more ironic. Or, on the other hand, you had to do something like melodrama, like Phantom or Les Mis, so it could be stylized.
Or Sweeney Todd.
And through sung, or Sweeney Todd. So it is, in a sense, part of that last gasp. But I must say, it's a brilliant last gasp to have included How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying and Fiddler on the Roof. They are both great examples of the Golden Age.
And
musical.
Guys and Dolls, probably, as well.
Well, Guys and Dolls is much earlier. It's 1950. So we're talking...
Frank Lesser, apart from those two shows, I mean, he's such a lauded lyricist and composer, and we've done whole episodes devoted to him on Musical Talk, but he hasn't really had much else, has he?
Well, not many of his other musicals succeeded. He did write quite a few others. Green Willow, which starred Anthony Perkins, a big film star at the time, was, I think, quite a disaster. It didn't run very long at all. The one that was best received was the almost completely operatic musical for which he wrote book music and lyrics, which is very famous and has a few famous songs from it. He was a very famous pop song writer for Hollywood.
He did
Baby It's Cold Outside.
Baby It's Cold Outside, one of the creepier Christmas songs.
Yeah, oh, it's a lovely song.
What's in my drink?
But he was already very well known as a pop song composer in the 30s and 40s by the time he wrote Guys and Dolls. Of course, he wrote Where's Charlie before Guys and Dolls, which is a very good adaptation of the famous English farce Charlie's Aunt, which had Ray Bolger, the scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. So there are about 5 shows, but you're right. I think it's largely because he died quite early. I think he died only 2 years after 1961, when this was a hit. And that's why you haven't heard more of him.
So he had lots of more. He had a lot more hits in him, you could say.
He possibly did, but he has, as I say, two shows that were major hits, Guys and Dolls and How to Succeed, and then one which was very respected in 1957, I think it was, and then this odd Green Willow, which people didn't seem to like.
I want to ask you, moving completely on, you can't see How to Succeed because it's not playing, but you can look out for it on the radio. We'll let you know when it's on. I want to ask you briefly, Robert, about Something Rotten, which you saw on Broadway. Apt title?
It was rotten. I have to say, I simply did not buy the hype. I mean, it's billed as the musical to sort of end all musical comedies, you know, that every sort of post 9/11 pastiche musical comedy is referenced in this show, and they actually mention,
which is ironic because all they do is parody other musicals.
Yes, and it's actually referenced in the show because Casey Nicholaw, the director and choreographer, has had a connection with every one of the producers, Spamalot.
What did he do in the producers?
He was, I think, assistant choreographer. Spamalot, which he choreographed. The Drowsy Chaperone, which I think he was assistant director and or choreographer. Aladdin, which he has to thank God and Disney for. And the most recent success being the Book of Mormon. Now, what the producers are trying to do is to sell this as the next Book of Mormon.
And by that you mean the producers of Something Rotten, not the
producers
musical, the producers.
Yeah, the producers of Something Rotten. But it ain't. It ain't the next Book of Mormon. I mean,
it seems more linked to Spamalot to me.
But I don't think it's as funny as Spamalot because, you know, you have got something. You have got a genuinely anarchic sense of humour.
It's something about Shakespeare in a parody that should be called Something Wicked, which would be an even cleverer title. I was listening to a preview of one of the songs and I turned it off the minute they pronounced Renaissance.
Well, some people do.
But Americans do, but if they're doing British accents, that's not how we say it. So it's wrong immediately.
They weren't doing British accents. Only Christian Ball did a sort of a Tim Curry voice. So he copied Tim Curry's British accent. What they do is, one of the girls in the production, I can't remember her name, channels Kristen Chenoweth. And then if you look at the programme, you realise that she was Kristen Chenoweth's understudy in one of her recent shows. Christian Ball, totally, I suddenly thought to myself, where have I heard this voice before? And then I thought, it's Tim Curry from the Rocky Horror Show. Well, actually, it's Tim Curry from Spamalot. So they've obviously been directed to do pastiche of these other actors. So there are types in the show which are all based on other performances from other musical comedies. But that makes no sense because the show isn't a takeoff of any of the other musicals. It's actually simply a takeoff of something like Shakespeare in Love. So then if you set your sights high, you think, oh, this is going to be a musical version of Shakespeare in Love. But actually it's not, because it's a very, very crude slapstick farce, knockabout farce, about Nick Bottom, do you get the joke, and his brother Nigel Bottom, who are actors who were very dissatisfied. Well, certainly Nick Bottom was very dissatisfied with the parts that he was playing in Shakespeare's company, so he left Shakespeare's company to set up his own company, but he's had nothing but flops, and he now wants to write a play to emulate and to compete with the great Shakespeare, and he hates Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's played as a kind of a pop star by Christian Ball. I must say, Christian Ball gave a good performance. I thought the other performances, although the voices were good, were fairly average. They weren't really funny. But to me, the show was scraping the barrel to find humour in this. I'll be very surprised if it really succeeds in Britain, because I think we're so much more au fait with Shakespeare. All you have to know for this production to be funny is that Shakespeare wrote to be or not to be, because that's the level of the jokes, the Shakespeare jokes. They're not very witty, they're not very informed by any knowledge of Shakespeare. But I thought the production was crude, it was excessive, there was far too much.
Why is it so popular then?
The critics have been kind, I think, which is one reason, so people go. It's also starring people who have been successful. I think the critics in New York tend to want to give good reviews wherever they can.
Unless you're Ben Brantley.
Well, unless the show's English. Then they feel free to give it a bad review. But if it's an American musical comedy, they think that they have the know-how. Well, yes, when they did The Book of Mormon,
And producers and...
Yes, and producers. They certainly demonstrated that Americans have the know-how. But then what the critics failed to notice is that the two...
But also the two people that do Book of Mormon are some of the greatest writers in TV history.
Of course, these people genuinely are postmodern. They genuinely are comic writers.
They do the greatest satire on television.
Exactly. They're satirical and they're witty, and you expect something funny from them. But the two hacks that have... And I've forgotten the names.
You expect something rotten from them.
Well, the two hacks that have cobbled this together are not the writers of South Park. They don't have the kind of wit.
Were the songs good? I'm guessing it's pastiche layered upon pastiche layered upon pastiche.
Well, it's hardly even pastiche. I don't know what they were going for in the songs. It's just sort of pop songs with an odd Elizabethan-sounding instrumentation.
Well, you have a lot more to talk about, Robert. I mean, you went to see Finding Neverland, and you revisited The Visit and stuff, so we'll have you on again soon to talk about that then. Robert Gordon, thank you very much again for joining me here on my podcast.
Thank you, Nick.
Goodbye. Thank you.